Now, I just want to go now to a rocket launch in China. We talk a lot about the military build-up in China. Well, what they've done now is launched a rocket, which is the first stage of the establishment of a Chinese space station. Have a look.
2、1，点火！点火！起飞！定零11:10.23分，15秒，613毫秒。
Yeah, there we go. That's a rocket into space. As I say, China looking to establish a permanent space station. And this is ordinarily, of course, great news, but it causes some concern around the world because we look at their military build-up in the South China Sea and elsewhere around their perimeter. Now they're very, very active in space. Let's catch up with the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, Greg Sheridan, just for a bit of an update on this situation. Thanks for joining us again, Greg. There's been so much focus on the military build-up in China of late, and particularly the way Australia has been calling it out, both through the new Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, and through the Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pozzullo. Just how extensive is China's military build-up across, say, the past decade?
Well, Chris, it's one of the great military build-ups in history, and just to give everyone a depressing weekend, I'd point out to you that no military build-up of this size and scale has ever taken place without it resulting in military conflict. You know, that old American saying, if your chief instrument is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And China has increased almost at an exponential rate, 10% a year for 20 years. It hides a lot of its military expenditure, so it's many tens of billions or even perhaps hundreds of billions more than we know. And it's all designed to hit America and hit American assets in Asia with the idea that if it could raise the cost to America sufficiently, America would abandon its allies or not be able to come to their assistance effectively. So that is an enormous challenge for everyone. And of course, the best way to preserve the peace is to convince the Chinese that even despite all their investment, it would still be too costly and too risky for them to initiate a conflict.
Yeah, now when I looked at Joe Biden's speech to Congress yesterday, I suppose the most comforting thing I drew out of it, I'll be very keen to get your thoughts, was the fact that he talked about ensuring that the US maintained its strength in the Indo-Pacific. That should be reassuring for Australia, shouldn't it?
I think so. I think, you've got to give marks where they're due. And I think Biden has been very good on China. The Biden administration has been very sensible, quite different from the second Obama administration. On the whole, it has continued Trump policy. Now, I think Biden has been poor on Iran, poor on the Middle East. A lot of his domestic policies are way to the left of anything I'd ever support. I think he's crackers on identity politics, but I do think on China and the central challenge in the Indo-Pacific, he and his whole administration, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the CIA, the interagency process, Pacific Command, the whole lot have been very good. Now, they've got a lot of work to do, a lot of catching up to do. And I even think that it's been very good that he's pulled out of Afghanistan and is trying to draw down in the Middle East, because if you're fighting a war in the Middle East, you're never going to devote the resources you need in the Pacific. The US Navy has shrunk, it's too small, can't do what we need it to do. So I think really Biden has been very good on China and the Indo-Pacific.
You're very fair. Yeah, I struggled to find a lot of that speech that I liked, but that was the most reassuring aspect, I think. Now, speaking of speeches, I'm keen to get your interpretation and what sense you draw from Scott Morrison's speech last night. I opened my show with it. I thought it was brilliant to hear our national leaders speaking about these issues, these core values that drive him and should drive all good governance, whether you're religious or not. That is respect, personal responsibility, human dignity.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. I'm not the least bit hesitant to criticise ScoMo if I think he's done the wrong thing or whatever. But I thought this was a brilliant speech, a truly brilliant speech, a landmark speech. Kevin Rudd challenged him earlier in the week to say, what do his religious convictions mean for him? Well, he said what they mean for him. They mean an attachment at the most profound level to human dignity and the assertion that each human being possesses inalienable and essential human dignity which does not depend on their gender or age or creed or ethnicity or background or belief system. You're right, Chris, to say that this is a principle which can be and is embraced by people of all faiths and none. I absolutely agree with that. But Scott Morrison gets to that point through his own profound Christian belief. And I would say that in Western civilization, the universalism at the heart of that vision is descended from Christian universalism, specifically the Apostle Paul's statement, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus. But you don't have to sign up to the Christian dimension of it. I thought it was a very fine speech. And a final thought, it did one thing politicians do far too little. It argued a case from first principles. Didn't try to say, how does this apply to, equal opportunity legislation or something. It just argued the proposition from first principles. I thought a very distinguished contribution to the national debate.
Well, I agree with you entirely. Let's just, for those who have just tuned in, just recap a little bit more of that speech. Here's another excerpt.
At the heart of our Judeo-Christian heritage are two words: human dignity. Everything else flows from this. And seeing the inherent dignity of all human beings is the foundation of morality. It makes us more capable of love and compassion, of selflessness and forgiveness.
There you go. There's some of the issues you were just expounding upon there, Greg. Now, the critics would jump in straight away and go to specifics. They'll say, what about the Billawheeler family? What about Australian Indians trying to get home? What about the unemployed? Now, you can always do that, but the way to judge these principles, these values, is how they're acted out through specific cases, but there's always a compromise to be made against one family as against the consequences for thousands of others and the like.
Yeah, I think that's right, Chris. That's not to say ScoMo's always got it right or that any other politician has always got it right. Kevin Rudd made a lot about ethics, but he was the guy who reinstituted offshore detention facilities in Papua New Guinea and so forth. There are terrible policy compromises all the time, but that doesn't mean either that you can just be a kumbaya idealist or that you abandon moral responsibility when you take those hard decisions. So no one died under Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders. 1,200 people died under no sovereign borders, died at sea. So, the moral equation is complex. One other point I'd very much like to make, Chris, with your indulgence. I also thought ScoMo's speech to the Australian Christian churches was a perfectly good speech. Now, he said that when people feel comforted by it, he prays with them in their distress. He lays hands on them in the great Christian tradition to give comfort, just like a nurse will lay hands on you in hospital to restore your confidence. And worst of all, he sometimes prays for people. What a shocking aggression. What a terrible thing.
I agree entirely, Greg, and we said so on this show. It's showing empathy, and whether you believe or not, that empathy, that generosity of his prayer should be accepted. I really appreciate you joining us again, Greg. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Now, as Greg Sheridan said, doesn't mean ScoMo always gets it right. You heard me at the top of the show. I think he's got it wrong in closing off our borders to Australians in India, and today effectively boasting, along with others, about closing off a backdoor passage to Australia from India for Australians. They should be able to come back here, but it was a brilliant speech. You can see the full transcript on the Prime Minister's website. If you're interested in it, log on there and have a look. It is a good read.